David experienced a great shock when he came to his senses. David opened his eyes, struggling to make sense of where he was. The room felt cold, sterile, like the type of place you only see in nightmares. He could hear the hum of machines around him, the soft beep of medical equipment, but the place was unfamiliar. The last thing he remembered was riding his motorcycle, the wind in his face, the freedom of the open road. And now, everything was wrong. Just as he tried to piece it all together, a voice he knew all too well, caught his attention. Claire. His heart surged. He had been so worried about her, imagining the pain she must have been going through. The sound of her voice brought a sense of relief, a desire to reach out, to tell her that he was here, that he was alive. For a moment, everything else faded away. But something was off. She wasn't crying or pleading for his recovery. No, her tone was cold, calculated. "Don't worry. Everything's going according to plan," Claire said softly, but David could hear every word, as if they were meant to pierce through the fog in his mind. A chill ran down his spine. What plan? What was she talking about? David wanted to move, to speak, but his body refused to cooperate. He was completely still, paralyzed by the wires and tubes that connected him to the machines. A feeling of dread began to creep over him. Why couldn't he speak? Why couldn't he get up? Outside the room, Claire's voice continued, but now it was different, colder. "He won't wake up again," she said, almost matter-of-factly. His heart pounded. Did she really say that? "I have more rights than his mother," she added. David's pulse quickened. What rights? Why was she talking like this? His thoughts were racing, but his body refused to respond. He was trapped, helpless in the very room where his life hung in the balance, unable to grasp what was happening. Panic gripped him as he realized Claire wasn't waiting for him to wake up. She didn't want him to. David's mind screamed for action, but his body betrayed him. He tried to lift his arms, move his legs, anything to signal that he was awake, that he was still here. But nothing. His muscles felt like lead, weighed down by the endless tangle of wires and tubes. His throat was dry, and his chest tightened with panic. How long had he been lying here? How long had Claire been plotting whatever twisted plan she was speaking of? Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and then another voice joined the conversation. It was a man's voice, calm, authoritative. The doctor, perhaps? David strained to hear. How much longer does he have to suffer? Claire asked, her voice sharp, almost impatient. Don't you think it would be better to let him go? Let him go. David's heart pounded harder in his chest. No! His mind screamed, but his lips couldn't move. The doctor's response was measured. His parents believe in him. They think he can pull through, the man said, his words lingering like a lifeline. Claire sighed. Yes, but how long can we drag this out? It hurts me to see him like this. David's blood ran cold. The woman he loved, the one person he thought he could trust, was discussing whether to end his life, and there was nothing he could do to stop her. He was powerless. David fought against the suffocating weight of his own body, desperate to make even the slightest sound. His mind screamed for release, his voice trapped somewhere deep within him. He tried to speak, to call out her name, to demand answers, but all that came out was a low, guttural noise, a sound so weak it barely filled the sterile room. Claire froze. Her back was turned, but she stiffened as if sensing something behind her. Slowly, she glanced over her shoulder, and their eyes met. David's heart raced as he saw her expression shift, from indifference to shock. She knew. She knew he was awake. Without hesitation, Claire darted out of the room, her voice sharp and hurried as she called for a doctor. A team of medical staff rushed in, surrounding David with clinical precision. They poked, prodded, whispered among themselves. Their faces were unreadable as they ran tests, checked machines, adjusted the wires that kept him bound. The doctor finally turned to Claire. He's still in a coma, ma'am. I'm very sorry. Claire stared at David, her face a mix of disbelief and frustration. For a brief moment, David wondered if she was questioning her own sanity. Did she believe what she had seen? Or was she convincing herself it had all been in her head? When everyone left, a young nurse stayed behind, gently placing a damp cotton swab on his lips to moisten them. David wanted to scream, but all he could do was lay there, helpless, watching as Claire's plan continued to unfold, all while he remained trapped inside his own body. Days passed, and David's mind never stopped racing. Every second he lay there, he replayed Claire's words in his head, the chilling indifference in her voice. The woman he loved had planned to let him die, to take his life for her own gain. Anger simmered beneath the surface, fueling him, giving him strength. But still, his body remained motionless, leaving him with nothing but his thoughts. Then, one afternoon, something changed. The same young nurse returned to moisten his lips as she had done every day, but this time, David felt a shift in his muscles. It was small, almost imperceptible, but when the cotton touched his lips, he managed to part them slightly, clenching the cotton to draw in water. The nurse paused, her eyes wide with shock. "Did you just?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. She leaned closer, watching intently. David tried again, willing every ounce of strength he had left into that one small movement. His lips twitched. It was enough. The nurse gasped and rushed out of the room, returning moments later with the doctor and several staff. They crowded around him, running more tests, adjusting his monitors, checking his vitals. This time, they saw it. David was waking up. The doctor smiled as he leaned in. "David, can you hear me?" he asked softly. David blinked, slowly, deliberately. The doctor stood up, pleased. "We'll call your wife," he said, turning to the nurse. "This will be a joyous moment for her." But just as the nurse reached for the phone, David summoned all the strength he had left to croak out one hoarse word. "No." Everyone froze. The doctor leaned back in, confused. "Don't tell her anything," David rasped, his voice weak but clear. "Please, I beg you." The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse, both of them baffled by David's plea. But something in his eyes told the doctor not to question him further. Later, as the nurse helped David take small sips of water, he whispered to her, explaining everything. His voice was shaky, his words halting, but he told her about Claire, about what he had heard that day. "She doesn't care about me. She wants me dead, for the inheritance." David's breath itched, the weight of his words crushing him as he finally spoke them out loud. "I trusted her. I gave her everything. But the moment I was out of the picture, she started making plans to replace me." His face twisted with pain. It wasn't just physical, it was the deep emotional betrayal that cut the deepest. The next morning, Claire received a call. The voice on the other end was soft, almost regretful. "It's over," they said. "You're now a widow." Claire's breath caught, but not out of grief. She quickly composed herself, murmuring words of fake sorrow as she thanked the hospital. As soon as the call ended, a smile crept across her face. It was over. Claire arrived at the hospital, determined to play the role of the grieving widow. She entered David's room with a heavy sigh, trying to mask the excitement bubbling inside her. She didn't notice the nurse who was cleaning the room, nor did she expect to hear the words that came next. "David isn't here anymore," the nurse said, looking up briefly from her task. Claire's heart leapt with joy. She fought the urge to smile, her lips twitching as she feigned sadness. I needed to see for myself," she muttered, barely able to contain herself. But as soon as she turned her back, Claire's calm demeanor broke. She rushed out of the room, practically running down the hallway, desperate to be away from the hospital, eager to move on to her new life. But outside the hospital, as she hurriedly hailed a taxi, David was waiting. He stood in the shadow of the building, watching her with a calm, almost eerie smile. She hadn't seen him. As the taxi sped away, David hailed his own and followed her home. The house that he had worked so hard to build. When he opened the door, laughter greeted him. A voice that wasn't Claire's. He crept closer, his heart pounding, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The living room door was ajar, and through the gap, he saw her, wrapped in nothing but a towel, standing with another man. "Let's light the fire, baby," the man said, pouring a drink. "We need to celebrate. You're finally free, and the money's ours." Claire laughed, her joy palpable. "Yes, finally. We have everything." David stepped through the door, his presence casting a long shadow across the room. Claire turned, and for a split second, the color drained from her face. Her eyes widened in shock and fear, like she had just seen a ghost. In that moment she knew. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stood frozen, her towel slipping slightly as she clutched it against her chest. The man beside her backed away, confusion etched on his face, but Claire was paralyzed. She blinked, as if trying to convince herself this was some sort of nightmare. "David?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why, you're alive?" David took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Surprised?" he said coldly. "You have 5 minutes to pack your things and leave my house." His words were sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Claire's face paled even more. "David, wait, please, let me explain," she pleaded, stepping toward him. "I thought you were dead. I didn't know how to handle the grief. But David raised a hand, silencing her. His face was stone. "Grief?" he scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Don't insult me, Claire. I heard everything. From the hospital. From your mouth. You didn't care about me, you only cared about the money." His voice grew louder, the pent-up anger finally spilling over. All the hurt, the betrayal, the lies, it was all too much. Claire's eyes flickered toward the man behind her, searching for help, but he had already retreated, gathering his things without a word. "David, please, it wasn't like that. I loved you. I thought you were gone, I was lost without you." Tears filled her eyes, but David saw through them. They weren't tears of regret, they were tears of desperation. "You started planning your life without me the moment I fell into that coma." David spat, stepping closer. "The inheritance, the house, even this guy." He gestured toward the stranger. "You moved on the second you thought you had it all figured out. You thought I'd never wake up, didn't you?" "David, no," Claire began, but David cut her off once again. "You have 5 minutes," he repeated, his voice firm, unyielding. "Get your things and leave. If you're still here when security arrives, they'll throw you out. And don't think for a second that you're getting a dime in the divorce." His final words hit like a hammer. Claire's expression shifted from desperation to fury. She had lost. She knew it, and in that moment the mask fell. You can't do this," she screamed, but the truth was, she knew she had no power left. The game was over, and she had lost it all. David watched as she scrambled to gather her belongings, her lover helping her without saying a word. His heart felt heavy, not from loss, but from the realization of how blind he had been, how easily he had trusted someone so willing to betray him. But now, the illusion was shattered. There was no going back. Claire's screams echoed through the house as she packed frantically, her rage barely contained. David stood firm, watching her with cold detachment. He had once loved this woman, trusted her with his life, his dreams. But now, all he saw was the shell of a person driven by greed. As the security guards arrived, Claire's voice hit a fevered pitch. She cursed him, calling him every name she could think of. "You'll regret this, David," she shouted, her face contorted in fury. "I deserve half of everything. You can't just throw me out." But David didn't flinch. "You don't deserve anything," he replied, his voice calm and resolute. "Everything I built, I did without you. And now you'll get exactly what you deserve, nothing." The guards ushered her and the lover out, their belongings hastily thrown together. The front door slammed shut, and with it, the weight of the betrayal began to lift from David's shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The house was quiet, a silence that once would have felt lonely but now felt like peace. David wasted no time. He called specialists to change the locks within the hour, ensuring that Claire would never set foot in his home again. "No one comes in except my parents," he told the guards. "No one else." It was a small but powerful declaration of his new boundaries. David was reclaiming his life, piece by piece. The divorce proceedings came swiftly. Claire, of course, tried to fight for a share of the house, the business, anything she could get her hands on. But David had planned everything carefully. The house was mortgaged under a large loan, a strategic move that meant Claire would inherit half the debt along with any property. Faced with the prospect of paying off that burden, she signed away her rights without hesitation. Her final words to him during the divorce hearing were filled with venom. She cursed him, her face twisted with resentment. "You'll pay for this, David. One day you'll see." But David didn't react. Her words meant nothing to him now. She had already taken everything that mattered once, but she wouldn't take another thing from him again. As the papers were signed, David felt a strange sense of closure. Not sadness, not anger, just relief. He had survived. The marriage, once built on love, had crumbled into nothing. But in that rubble, David found a new strength, a resolve to live for himself and not for the manipulations of others. And so it ended. Weeks passed, and David slowly began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. The house felt different now, like a sanctuary instead of a battleground. But something still lingered in his mind, the nurse who had helped him through the hardest days, who had seen the truth in his eyes when no one else did. He couldn't stop thinking about her. She had been a quiet presence, always there, always kind. One afternoon, David found himself back at the hospital, a bouquet of roses in hand. When he saw her, his heart lifted. "I never got to thank you properly," David said, his voice softer now, filled with gratitude. "I wanted to ask you out, but if you don't want to, I'll understand." She smiled warmly. "My shift ends in an hour," she replied. "Walking sounds like the perfect rehabilitation, don't you think?" David smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. A new journey had begun.